Forked Tongues, a new series of talks on the theme of language today. The speaker this evening is the scientist Brian J. Ford, and the talk is called Travel Narrows the Mind.
In this, the new age of computerized bank statements, television data pages, and the clattering shutters of airport departure boards, I'm beginning to feel that language is going out of fashion. The crisp precision of those sterile little messages from TV screens and computer printouts gives a steely meaning to a word, a significance as sharp as frost and as recognizable as an oak leaf. Now, language may function as a mathematical thing to a machine, but as we concentrate more closely on the words, we're losing sight of the spaces between them. And we're beginning to forget that communication is a cultural thing, that words mean different things to people of disparate backgrounds, and that strung together into necklace sentences, the beads of a language make patterns that change from minute to minute, like the shades of sunlight in a glass. The tale is told of a traveller who was touring through Ireland and stopped to ask how far it was to the next village. "'Tis about 5 miles, said a local after a moment's thought, "but you're in a car, so it'll be more like 3. A little while later, the tourist's car broke down and he had to walk on. Soon he asked someone else about his destination, and this time he was told, "Well, from here it's only 3.5 miles, but you're on foot. Well then, better think of it as 2. How Irish, we say, how amusing, how condescending, say I, and how little we know of the way we speak. Of course it makes us smile if someone uses words in a way that seems wrong to us. Everything we know seems to us the right way of knowing, and anything that doesn't fit our preconceptions we reject as muddle-headed. Yet though you may think it's funny to use distances in that vague kind of way, we actually make just the same kind of mistake ourselves. A tired shopper may well say he's walked miles in search of some elusive commodity, even if it was only 100 yards. He's actually talking about his frustrations, and not the distance. And as any telephonist will tell you, people say they've been hanging on for hours, if it was anything more than a minute. So we use these words flexibly too, and it won't do to say that the Irish tale is superficially funny. It is different, that's all. It comes from a different culture. Now, I know it's pretty unfashionable these days to admit that there are such things as cultural distinctions between the races of mankind. But even in differing areas of Britain, the same set of words can signify differing ideas. In the Midlands, for instance, somebody who asks, "What are you going on about?" may mean, "What subject are you discussing?" whilst the same question to a Southerner is more likely to sound insulting, as though she's being asked, "What on earth are you wittering about now?" A liberated West Countryman might say, "You look very charming," to mean nothing but a compliment. A sceptical Southerner might interpret the words as, "You look very charming," which implies that the appearance belies the reality. And a Northerner, who uses bouncy sarcasm in a way that other people often misunderstand, will use, "You look very charming," as a form of firm disapproval. Yes, we do like to imagine that people are all fundamentally the same, and that those national divisions we used to hear of in the past have been recognized as spurious. But it just isn't so. How could it be? Our culture results from an unfathomably complex web of stimuli and formal teaching, of accidental learning and acquired truths, and no two people from different places can ever share the same formative processes. It is true that, to the British eye, the Germans are obedient, the Italians amorous, the French arrogant, and the Americans brash, just as it's true that, to outsiders, we British are reserved, or to be more direct, hypocritical. The reason we persist in imagining that racial distinctions are dead and gone is because we never knew they were there. We don't celebrate national distinctions because we confuse integration with indoctrination. And when we say that we tolerate foreigners, or we like immigrants, we really mean that we like them when they conform to our arbitrary way of life. What we like to call race relations amounts to swamping immigrants with our own version of cultural normality, as though that was the only right way to behave. The extent to which other nationalities have acquired British patterns of behaviour is an astonishing phenomenon, one that would be well worth some research. Heaven knows why it should be, but a Frenchman speaking his language with an English accent sounds, to the French, somehow more aristocratic, the working-class French accent being more guttural by far. Much the same is true of other European languages, and it even applies to overseas versions of our own tongue. Thus, an American speaking with a slight English accent sounds dignified to other American ears. The drawl of a US accent, by contrast, sounds to us more modern, more hip. Perhaps the most familiar illustration of this strange effect lies in the world of song. Take a Frenchman, a Swede, an American, and a British singer, and talk to them in English, and you'll find their national accents much as you'd expect. But have them sing a pop song, and they will all do it with American accents. There's even an East German group that wrote a number called Gimme a Head of Stone. On the other hand, if your singers move upmarket to perform opera, then all their accents, even the careful intonation of a tenor from Texas or a soprano from Baltimore, will be as English as anyone could manage, and more perfectly enunciated than you or I would ordinarily bother with. And the effect isn't only found in speech. Throughout Japanese industry, the directors have themselves photographed in well-cut suits of traditional English style, and black businessmen from the Commonwealth equip themselves with beautifully tailored shirts and suits as they make the executive grade. Now, is that because people always like to fit into the orthodoxies of countries they're going to visit? Well, that can't be the answer. American and European executives don't put on the traditional robes of Africans or the exotic dress of the Japanese when they go to do business in Luanda or Tokyo. And here lies the root of our blindness to cultural difference. As other people acquire our behaviour and our dress, and use our language in their daily lives, they take from us the need to understand the differences that underpin everyone's identity. The condescending, bland monotony that we take for egalitarianism snatches from our grasp the chance to see the peoples of the world as they really are, and to mirror the reality of our own race, with all its inwardness and negativism, in their special qualities. I mentioned how our clinical and terse way with words is stifling our understanding of the way that the ebb and flow of a whole language instills meaning at a deeper and more emotional level. You might conclude from this that the further you went from our microchip culture, the richer the language would be. And it is often true that races that are, in our eyes, more primitive by far, preserve a greater awareness of the power of speech. Should you wish to slip easily back through thousands of years of time to a culture that is unrefined by artifice, unadulterated by sophistication, you might sit with the Aborigines of Australia and experience their ways. Their whole culture is founded on talk, on language, on the interplay of people who are older and more wise with those who are young and who thirst for wisdom. At predetermined ages, the young members of the tribe progress through set stages of learning until the whole tribal understanding is colloquially passed from one generation to the next. We see these people as anachronistic. Most white Australians who live in the Aboriginal states long to see the back of their Stone Age predecessors and regard them as too far behind ever to catch up. Many actively wish them, as though for their own good, dead and out of it. Yet, are we so superior? The Aborigines exist in a union with nature that we could do well to emulate. A glance at the ground or the lie of the land can show Aborigines where food lies or where water may be found. And these highly developed powers of observation are a type of high intelligence denied to us. Our own use of language, such a potent indicator of the paucity of our lives, shows that we've become semi-literate alongside the verbally enriched Stone Age people of Australia. In place of personal parental dialogues with our children, we have the encoded electronic voice of the TV set and the news bulletin. Whereas our supposedly primitive neighbours talk endlessly to their children in those far-off lands, instructing them and passing on the wisdom of the ages, We sit our children in little regimented rooms at school, making them memorize a few scraps of irrelevant knowledge, in the belief that this will give them examination passes, which fit them for their adult lives, squatting for the bulk of their leisure time in front of a flickering glass screen in the corner of the room. Let me tell of two parallel instances which show how far we've retreated towards an automated and unthinking fate. You could call it the tale of the two generators. One of them burned out in a car driving through the outskirts of Delhi. Inquiries showed that within a week or two a replacement could be sent out from England and the job done. But a houseboy had a much better idea. His father was the village blacksmith and could do the job far quicker. He did. Within a few days he'd carefully taken the device apart, rebuilt it, rewound the coil, and had it working as good as new. His charge was 30 shillings, and the last I heard the car was purring as contentedly as if nothing had ever happened to it. The other generator burned out on a British motorway. The driver was baffled and had no idea what was wrong. In the end, he telephoned his father to give his car a tow to the local garage for an overhaul. The driver on that occasion had just completed an intensive course on general engineering, but he had no idea how to begin to diagnose the fault, and the last I heard, that car was still waiting to be fixed. How foolish it is to imagine that the high-flown words and stereotyped ideas of our self-centered era are teaching us how to live. In truth, as we are acquiring more and more verbal specialization, we're using language, real language, less and less, and we're communicating meaning and ideas to a dangerously limited extent. We are educating the young to remain uneducated. It would be reassuring to believe that increased travel will break down these cultural barriers, and the budget-priced air ticket fuse all nations and all races into a homogeneous community of like-thinking people. But as far as one can see, the opposite often happens. People say travel broadens the mind, but I see it as hardening the prejudices. In the communist countries of Eastern Europe, in the tropical jungles of the Pacific, in the tribal lands of the black and yellow people, I've seen the tourists in those buses looking out of the windows like goldfish trapped in a wine glass. Look at that strange policeman, they say. Listen to the funny way they talk, without giving a thought for what they've left back at home. Could anything be funnier than a policeman with a plastic dome for a hat, like a magnified match head, proceeding in an orderly fashion northwest along the high street? If you want an instant example of what I mean about the way we distance ourselves from other people's cultures, then leaf through that travel brochure that's poking out from the magazine rack. Go on. There are page upon page of hotels with their European-style food and their unidentifiably anonymous terraces. The maid-serviced apartments, all white and blue and international-looking in the retouched sunlight. Where's the thrust of local colour, the jostling in the marketplace, the visitors being thrown in at the deep end of life in their new home, instead of cautiously dipping in the shallow end of the heated pool at the hotel, where the signs are all in English? Now, you might think that we need to avoid these big cultural shocks and might just as well stay at home, but even that won't do, I'm afraid. Though we imagine that the greater the social barriers, the more difficulties you encounter between people on both sides of the fence, it often turns out that smaller differences count for more. The edge that develops between Indians of different caste is often more acrimonious than the differences that spring up between coloureds and whites. The Nazis reacted far more violently against the Jews, from whom it was often impossible to tell them apart, than they ever did against the dark-skinned races. And the animosity that burns between devout Christians of two faiths in Northern Ireland and elsewhere is as vicious as anything else. Now, the small differences often cause huge disagreements. There's one essentially biological reason I can put forward for this. The whole of nature's diversity results from what we call speciation, that is, the forming of new species. Now, if organisms tolerated small differences in behaviour and appearance, then newly divergent types would soon merge back together again. I conclude that the recognition of small differences in ourselves and the way that we react instinctively against them is a model of what all living organisms need if they're going to evolve. The lesson of this is that mankind is more diverse than we pretend. There are even language conventions that amount to a separate culture within a school, an institution, or a club, which set one group of people apart from their fellows. In science, you find cliques who say carcinogen, carcinogen, or carcinogen, and I've even visited universities where they talk of microscopy and psychiatry and psychology, new pronunciations which define group loyalties and fashionable trends. Little pet phrases that signify something special to people in one office may mean nothing in the world to other people working in the same business exactly, but in a building across the street. We create a separate culture for children with our GG all gone language, which they're forced to learn at a certain age and then made to unlearn a couple of years later. If only we could see this arbitrariness for what it is, we might begin to find some answers to the pressing problems that beset us. For example, we used to imagine that the Americans and Russians would soon sort out their differences if only they would meet around a table. But I've sat in on many discussions across that wall, and the more intimately the cultures meet, the more perplexed and bewildered they seem to be by each other's attitudes. Our throwaway materialism seems unutterably stupid to many races, just as their willingness to accept restriction or whatever seems inexplicable to us. The oaths and threats uttered by other people, as in those Islamic demonstrations which caused such a furore in Britain earlier in the year, acquire a more rational appearance when we view them against their cultural background. Not long ago, many of you were outraged by the black communities of Bristol talking openly about their use of marijuana, at the same time as we were horrified by the Saudis' hostility towards British residents using alcohol. But marijuana is nothing worse than alcohol to many cultures, whilst, to many others, the taking of alcohol is as illegal as taking drugs is to us. Language barriers have a rare ability to inflame. In our own country, you can show acts of the most horrifying brutality on the TV screen night after night with little complaint and no hostility, though a scene with sex in it will set the telephones ringing at the producer's office. Neither sex nor violence, though, will attract the attention that a single swear word will stir up for itself. And here we have a situation where a tiny and harmless utterance, a single small sound, will generate more reaction than a concerted act of hostility and brutality. Could there be any more powerful indicator of the importance of the cultural background in which a word is said, or of the need to understand such unbalanced and irrational forces? If we could come to terms with these elements of reality, we could gain much, both in the new perspectives we would acquire, and also in accepting the humbling fact that we're not so perfect ourselves. In many ways, language reveals the cultural past of a people and reflects the struggle they have had to emerge into the modern era. In other respects, it helps mould new patterns for the future. Above all, the cadence of words is a uniquely powerful indicator of the differences that exist between the peoples of the world, distinctions that can mirror our own values, and which can show the origin of many unadmitted sources of international hostility and interpersonal strife. In this celebration of our differences lies the key to understanding our common purpose on this earth. The fact that we can talk about these things can bring us nearer to a solution, but an examination of how we talk and why we say the things to each other that we do could uncover a new age of contact and conciliation.
That talk, Travel Narrows the Mind, was by Brian J. Ford.